On August 1st, Donald Trump told the world he was locked and loaded, ready to launch what U.S. officials were describing in private briefings as one of the biggest bombing campaigns since World War II. Not a symbolic strike, not a warning shot, a sustained multi-day campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure. Israel had already agreed to take part. The State Department had issued a fresh travel warning telling every American across the Middle East to consider leaving immediately. Kuwait was reporting Iranian drone activity near its bases. Tehran was publicly threatening every country hosting a U.S. military installation. This was not posturing. This was a region bracing for the largest escalation of the entire war. And then, in less than 24 hours, it was gone. Trump announced he was canceling the strikes. He said Iran and several other Middle Eastern governments had personally asked him to hold off. He said the parameters of a deal on the Strait of Hormuz had essentially been agreed to, and that a deal on the nuclear issue would follow shortly after. He said negotiations would begin Monday morning. Monday came. Iran's foreign ministry did not confirm any of it. They said, in plain language, that there were no negotiations currently taking place. Not talks are complicated, not we need more time. They said there was nothing to resume because, in their telling, nothing had actually been agreed to in the first place. By Tuesday, on Air Force One, Trump was calling the Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous. So sit with that timeline for a second. Saturday, the biggest strike of the war, announced and then called off within a day, credited to a diplomatic breakthrough. Monday, the other side says the breakthrough doesn't exist. Tuesday, the president who announced the breakthrough is now accusing that same government of lying. Somewhere in that 72-hour window, one of two things happened. Either the President of the United States described a diplomatic achievement that was never real, or Iran is denying a deal that actually exists for reasons of its own. Neither explanation is comfortable, and almost none of the coverage circulating right now is asking which one it actually is, or more importantly, why either scenario would be unfolding at exactly this moment in exactly this war. That's what we're doing today, not the headline, the structure underneath it. This is Geo Frontline X, and if you're new here, this channel has one rule. We don't panic, and we don't do cheerleading. We follow incentives. We follow the logic of power because governments very rarely act against their own incentives for long, no matter what they say in a press conference. Today, I'm going to walk you through three things, in order, and I want you to hold on to all three because by the end, they connect into one picture. First, I'm going to show you why the United States is running into a hard physical ceiling on how much more of this war it can fight. A ceiling that has nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with a spreadsheet in the Pentagon that almost nobody is talking about publicly. Second, I'm going to show you why Iran has every strategic reason to deny a deal exists, even in a scenario where real conversations really are happening behind closed doors, and why that denial is not confusion, it's a deliberate domestic strategy. Third, I'm going to show you who has actually come out ahead over these past 6 days of contradictory statements, canceled strikes, and falling oil prices. And it is very likely not the country your instinct is telling you right now. Let's start with the numbers, because before we get into interpretation, you need to see the raw material everyone is working with. Since this war reignited on February 28th, the United States has been consuming precision air defense interceptors at a rate that has no real precedent in the modern era of American warfare. Independent defense analysts tracking procurement and expenditure data have estimated that Patriot interceptor stockpiles have fallen to somewhere around a third of their pre-war levels. THAAD interceptor inventories, the top tier of American ballistic missile defense, have dropped by more than a third as well. I want you to actually sit with what those two systems do, because the scale of the problem doesn't land until you understand the economics underneath it. A single Patriot interceptor costs somewhere in the range of $4 million. A single THAAD interceptor runs upward of $12 million. Now compare that to what they're shooting down. Iranian ballistic missiles and drones cost a fraction of that. In some cases, a small fraction. Every single time Iran fires something toward a US base or an allied position, the United States is often responding with a piece of hardware that costs many multiples more than the threat it's intercepting. That is not a sustainable exchange rate in any war of attrition, and this has become a war of attrition. Now layer on the production side. Lockheed Martin's entire annual output of Patriot interceptors sits under 200 units a year. From the moment a contract is signed to the moment a missile is actually delivered and combat ready takes somewhere between 3 and 5 years. THAAD production capacity is even more constrained. There have been announcements about scaling up manufacturing significantly, but that expanded capacity does not exist yet. It's a plan on paper, not missiles in a bunker. Here is the part that should genuinely concern you if you're trying to understand what actually happened this weekend. The missiles currently being delivered to units in the Persian Gulf were funded and ordered years before this current phase of the war even began. You cannot manufacture your way out of a munitions shortfall in the middle of an active conflict. The lead times are simply too long. Whatever stockpile the United States has right now is functionally close to the stockpile it's going to have for the next several years, minus whatever gets used. So picture the conversation that almost certainly happened inside the Pentagon in the final days of July, when officials were reportedly drawing up plans for a multi-day campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure. A campaign like that does not happen in a vacuum. Hitting Iranian energy infrastructure directly, at scale, is the kind of escalation that guarantees a serious retaliatory response. Sustained missile and drone fire aimed at U.S. bases and allied positions across the region for days, not hours. And someone in that planning process had to ask the uncomfortable question: if Iran empties a significant portion of its remaining arsenal back at us in response, what exactly do we intercept it with? Because the honest answer, based on where stockpiles currently sit, is not indefinitely, and not without running dangerously close to the bottom of the barrel on systems that take years to refill. This is what I call the military ratchet, and it only turns one direction. Every interception drains a stockpile that cannot be quickly replaced. Every failed interception, and there have been failures in this war, produces American casualties, which produces political pressure to retaliate harder. Retaliating harder produces more incoming fire, which requires more interceptors, which drains the stockpile further. The ratchet clicks forward. It does not click back. And right now, the honest assessment inside the defense establishment is that a full-scale, multi-day air campaign against Iran is a bet the United States can make exactly once, maybe, before serious questions arise about what's left in reserve for anything else happening simultaneously around the world. That is not a war America is confidently winning through sheer capability. That is a war America is currently subsidizing at an exchange rate that gets worse every single week it continues. And that reality, far more than any sudden diplomatic breakthrough, is very likely the actual force that pulled the plug on Saturday's planned strike. Now, let's cross over to Tehran, because the Iranian denial that followed is not confusion, and it is not incompetence. It is calculated, and it serves a very specific domestic purpose. Iran has spent every month of this war constructing one central narrative, both for its own population and for the wider region. The United States and Israel attacked, and Iran did not fold. Iran fought two of the most capable militaries on earth to a standstill and refused to surrender its core positions. That narrative is not just propaganda for its own sake. It is the entire justification for 6 months of extraordinary hardship inside Iran. Rolling blackouts, severe inflation, executions of protesters under wartime justifications, a population being asked to absorb enormous costs, told that the sacrifice is buying something historic, the humbling of the American war machine. Now imagine what it does to that narrative if Iran's own foreign ministry stands up and says, yes, we personally asked the Americans to stop attacking us, and yes, we are now sitting down to negotiate the terms of a deal. To an outside observer, that might sound like reasonable diplomacy. Inside Iran, to a population that has been told for 6 months that they are winning a historic confrontation, that sentence reads as something very different. It reads as the first public admission that the regime is negotiating from a position where it needed the fighting to stop. That is a domestic political cost the Iranian leadership cannot easily absorb, especially while managing internal unrest, economic strain, and visible cracks inside the regime's own political factions. So instead of confirming anything, they deny it. Not necessarily because no conversations are happening behind closed doors. Multiple outlets have reported some kind of understanding to continue talking. But because publicly admitting a deal is in progress costs Tehran far more at home than staying deliberately vague costs it internationally. This is, in a strange way, the exact mirror image of Trump's own problem. He needs a story where he is the dealmaker who forced Iran into a corner and extracted concessions through strength. Iran needs a story where it was never cornered, never asked for anything, and remains definitely at war on its own terms. Both of those narratives can technically be built from a very narrow, cherry-picked slice of the same private conversation. Both leaders have every incentive to keep telling their own version to their own audience, and neither one has a strong incentive to publicly reconcile the two stories. This is not two governments failing to communicate. This is two governments running two entirely separate domestic messaging operations off the same underlying set of private exchanges, and the contradiction you're watching play out publicly is simply the seam where those two operations don't quite line up. There's a well-established concept in political science that explains Trump's half of this equation with unusual precision. It comes from the political scientist James Fearon, and it's called audience costs. The core idea is simple but powerful. In democratic systems, when a leader makes a loud, public, unambiguous threat and then backs down without anything visible to show for it, voters remember. Backing down without a win attached to it carries a real, measurable political price. Now, look at what Trump had already put on the record before Saturday. He had said, publicly and in writing, that the United States was locked and loaded for the biggest strike since World War II. That is about as unambiguous a threat as a leader can make. He could not simply cancel that operation and say nothing further, because a silent cancellation reads, to any political observer, as a retreat under pressure. He needed a story that converted the cancellation into a victory, a negotiated outcome, a diplomatic win, something that could be framed as strength rather than hesitation. That is very likely the actual origin point of Saturday night's announcement. It doesn't necessarily mean zero conversations took place with Iranian or Gulf intermediaries. It very likely means that whatever informal, partial, or preliminary understanding existed got dressed up publicly as something far more concrete and far more finalized than it may have actually been, because the alternative explanation, munitions constraints and pressure from allied Gulf governments, does not read as a win to an American audience watching cable news. And this matters enormously right now because of the calendar. Midterm elections land in November of this year. From this point forward, virtually every visible decision the administration makes on Iran is going to be filtered through one governing question. Does this reinforce the story that we are winning, or does it look like weakness heading into an election? Iranian negotiators are not naive about American politics. They have watched this exact pattern play out for 6 months now. They understand precisely how much leverage the American electoral calendar hands them in these final months before voters go to the polls, and there's no reason to believe they aren't calibrating their own public statements and private demands around exactly that vulnerability. Before I go further, I want to give you the strongest possible version of the opposing argument because you deserve the real debate here, not a simplified one built to confirm whatever framework I've already laid out. The Steelman case goes like this. The United States remains, by a wide margin, the most capable military force on the planet. Munitions production, however slow right now, can be scaled up over time with enough political will and enough funding. Washington retains the option to widen its target set beyond military infrastructure to civilian-facing energy assets, which would make the economic cost of continued resistance unbearable for the Iranian population over a longer horizon. And notice something important. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar all reportedly pushed hard for this specific strike to be called off. That tells you they still believe Iran retains real, dangerous capability, which means Washington still holds meaningful cards it has deliberately chosen not to play yet. All the United States needs in this reading is patience and sustained political resolve. That argument is not nothing. Serious, well-informed people hold this view, and it is not wrong that the United States retains enormous latent military and economic capability that dwarfs Iran's on paper. Here is what that argument struggles to explain, though. If Washington genuinely held an overwhelming decisive hand here, it would not require 3 separate Gulf governments, plus Iran itself, all simultaneously pressuring it to stand down before a campaign that officials themselves were internally describing as the harshest since World War II. Great powers holding a comfortably winning position do not typically need multiple outside parties begging them not to use their strongest available option. The fact that so much external pressure was required to stop this specific strike tells you something real about how contested the actual risk calculus looked from inside the room, regardless of how the public announcement was ultimately framed. So if Washington is genuinely constrained by munitions math, and Tehran is running a careful domestic narrative operation, who has actually come out ahead over these past 6 days of contradictory statements, a canceled war, and swinging oil prices? Not the United States, not Iran. The clearest beneficiaries are the Gulf states themselves, and by extension, the buyers of the oil this entire war keeps threatening to disrupt. Walk through what actually happened here, step by step. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar all reportedly pushed Trump directly to cancel the planned strikes. This is not because these governments have any particular affection for Tehran. It's because a sustained multi-day American air campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure, conducted right next door to their own oil and gas facilities and shipping lanes, represents a direct and immediate threat to their own economies, regardless of which side ultimately comes out ahead in the broader war. Oil prices spiking uncontrollably, shipping lanes closing further than they already have, retaliatory Iranian strikes landing near their own territory. None of that serves the interests of the Gulf monarchies, no matter who wins the underlying conflict. So they lobbied, and within roughly 24 hours, the single largest planned strike of this entire war was called off. Stop and consider how much genuine leverage that represents for governments that are, on paper, junior partners in the broader American-led coalition in the region. That is not the behavior of bystanders. That is the behavior of parties sitting close enough to the table to actually move outcomes. And look at what happened to oil the moment those strikes were canceled. Prices fell almost immediately. Every single day this war continues to grind on without a truly decisive escalation. Energy markets remain roughly where the Gulf oil producers arguably want them, volatile enough to keep prices elevated above where they'd otherwise sit, but stable enough that supply itself never actually collapses into full crisis. That outcome is close to ideal for oil exporting neighbors who profit from sustained regional tension without wanting an actual regional collapse happening directly on their doorstep. Meanwhile, the two parties publicly promising escalation, Washington and Tehran, both have powerful domestic reasons to keep talking tough for their respective home audiences, even while neither one can currently afford to actually fight the full-scale war they keep threatening. The loudest voices in this story are, right now, the ones with the least room to actually act on what they're saying. The quietest players, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, are the ones who just demonstrated they can move the entire trajectory of the conflict with a phone call. Based on everything we've just walked through, here are 3 specific predictions. Write them down, come back to this video in 30 days, and hold me accountable for whether I was right. Prediction number 1, no durable, formally signed agreement emerges from these Monday negotiations within the next month. The underlying incentives on both sides are structurally incompatible right now. Trump needs a visible, public win he can point to. Iran needs to maintain a narrative that it was never cornered into negotiating in the first place. Those two stories cannot both survive contact with a real, signed public document that both governments would have to acknowledge simultaneously. Prediction number 2. Within the next 60 days, we see at least one more cycle that follows this exact same pattern. A major strike gets threatened publicly, then gets suddenly canceled and credited to a diplomatic breakthrough, and the other side publicly denies that any such breakthrough exists. This is no longer a one-time anomaly. It is becoming a repeating operating pattern for how this war actually moves forward in fits and starts. Prediction number 3. Gulf state diplomatic activity, not statements out of Washington or Tehran, becomes the most reliable early warning signal for the next escalation cycle. Watch Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha closely, more closely than you watch the two nominal combatants. They have the most to lose from an actual full-scale war, and they have now demonstrated, clearly and publicly, an ability to apply the brakes when they judge the risk has become too high for their own economies. Here are 3 specific things I want you to track over the coming weeks, things that will tell you the real story faster than any official statement will. First, watch Brent crude prices closely. They dropped when the strikes were called off this past weekend. If tensions flare again, pay close attention to how quickly and how sharply that price reverses. The speed of that reversal will tell you how much the market genuinely believes any underlying deal is real versus how much it is simply reacting to the headline of the moment. Second, watch for public statements specifically out of Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. If those governments go quiet again, that is a reasonable signal that the immediate danger of a major strike has genuinely passed. If they suddenly become vocal again, treat that as your early warning that something is heating back up behind the scenes before it becomes obvious in the headlines. Third, watch the gap between what Iran's foreign ministry says to international media and what Iranian state broadcasters are telling the domestic population. When those two channels start telling noticeably different versions of events, that gap is usually one of the clearest available signals that there's an unresolved internal argument still being fought out inside the regime itself. Here's the question I want to leave you with. On Saturday, the United States announced it was prepared to launch its largest strike on Iran since World War II. By Monday, that strike no longer existed. A deal that may or may not be real was being publicly celebrated. And the other side was calling that celebration an outright lie. That is not the behavior of two confident governments cleanly executing an agreed plan. That is the behavior of two governments each straining to control a story that neither one fully controls the underlying facts of. The most dangerous moment in a conflict like this one is rarely when both sides are shouting the loudest. It's the moment when both sides need the shouting itself to mean far more than the reality actually supports. This has been GeoFrontline X. If this analysis helped you see the structure underneath the headlines, subscribe, because this story is moving fast, and I will be tracking every turn of it as it develops. Tell me in the comments, do you believe a real deal genuinely exists somewhere underneath all of this? Or is this entire episode being run purely for two separate domestic audiences at the same time? I read every response, and they shape exactly what we cover next.